Chapter 13, Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand. This chapter will, in a sense, summarize everything that is now going to come. Okay, so this is an important chapter because it lays out the entire fundamental economics behind everything that we are now going to study from now on to the end of the course. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is revert to my drawing board. Okay. So this is going to be our story from now on, and everything will tie into this diagram that I'm now going to put up here on the screen. I'm going to draw a diagram that is now very familiar to you, a diagram of a market in equilibrium. But there will be some differences from what you already know. I am going to treat the whole economy as a single market. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to treat the entire economy as a single market. Now, typically, in a diagram like this, what do you measure along the horizontal axis? What is measured along the horizontal axis? Somebody? Quantity, is that correct? So if this were the market for beef, for instance, what you would measure along the horizontal axis would be the quantity of beef. And what you would measure along the vertical axis would be the price per pound of beef. Correct? However, this is not the market for beef. This is the entire economy. So therefore, what are we going to measure along this horizontal axis? We are going to measure along this horizontal axis the quantity of all final goods and services. Remember, we're treating the economy as if it were a single market. Right? So instead of the quantity of beef, we now want the quantity of all goods and services, all final goods and services. And what is our measure of the quantity of all final goods and services? Somebody. Come on. What is our measure of the quantity of all final goods and services? I need an answer, somebody.
The GDP?
Yes. Real. Now, does this occur to some of you, or I mean, some of you know this and just keeping quiet? Is that it? I certainly hope so. Okay, because these things should ring bells with you now at this point. Right? The output of all final goods and services is measured by
GDP.
Let me ask you a question now. Nominal or real? Nominal GDP or real GDP? What measures the output, the physical output, really? What is the measure of the actual output of final goods and services? Would that be nominal or real? Somebody said nominal. But nominal GDP may go up even if the actual physical production of the economy doesn't change. Nominal GDP could go up simply because prices have gone up. You see, the economy may produce the same 100 pounds of apples that it produced last year, but if apples cost more this year, then the value of this year's output would be higher than last year's output. Nominal GDP will have gone up, but the physical output of apples hasn't gone up. So clearly, it isn't nominal GDP that is our measure of the output of the economy. What is the measure? The real GDP. Now, if you recall, how do we measure economic growth? How do we measure percent economic growth between one year and the next? Come on. Come on. How do we measure economic growth between one year and the next? Are you all drawing blanks? No, that would be the rate of inflation. Percent change in the value of the CPI from one year to the next. Now, isn't percent economic growth the percent change in the value of real GDP? So wouldn't that be real GDP in year T minus real GDP in year T minus 1 divided by real GDP in year t minus 1, this times 100. Isn't that right? That's how you measure percent economic growth. We've studied this before. So economic growth is defined as the increase in real GDP, not nominal GDP, but real GDP, because real GDP is our measure of the actual output of the economy. Nominal GDP factors in price as well, you see. So nominal GDP could go up simply because of inflation. So you have the same output as before, but simply because prices have gone up this year, nominal GDP will have gone up. But can you then say that there has been economic growth? You can't, because the economy is producing exactly the same quantity of goods as last year. Right? So what we need is real GDP as our measure of economic growth. Okay, I'm going to pause here a second, because so we are going to measure on the horizontal axis the quantity of all final goods and services, and that is measured by real GDP, which we are going to call Y. Y is our symbol for real GDP. What do we measure on the vertical axis? Now, typically we measure the price of the good. The good, but in this case we are not talking about a good, we are talking about all goods. So what would be our measure of the prices of all the final goods and services that make up real GDP? What is our measure of all prices? Now, you have to think about the chapter on inflation, where we spoke about price indices. Now, what is the consumer price index, for instance? Now, isn't that a measure of all prices? Correct? The consumer price index does what? It tracks changes in the cost of that shopping cart full of goods and services that the average American lives on. Is that correct? So the consumer price index is a measure then of all prices of consumer goods and services. But here we are talking about real GDP, which is more than consumer goods and services. Right? Real GDP would include, for instance, investment goods, earth-moving machinery, for instance, which consumers don't buy. Correct? So therefore, we are going to need what kind of price index? Not the consumer price index, but the GDP price index. Correct? We want the GDP price index. Now, what is the GDP price index? It's kind of like the consumer price index. The only difference is that the particular basket of goods being tracked, or rather the changes in the cost of the basket that is being tracked, is a bigger basket than the consumer's basket, than the market basket, because it contains heavy earth-moving equipment, for instance. Correct? So we have the GDP price index on the vertical axis, and this we are going to call P. Okay, so this is going to be P, our price level. Now, we've defined the price level before when we were talking about the real wage. If you recall, I mentioned in class last time that the real wage was equal to the nominal wage divided by the consumer price index by 100. And this I called P, the price level. I'm going to do something similar here. I'm going to divide this by 100, and I'm going to call that the price level. So this here is our price level. This is our measure of all prices. Prices of all final goods and services. Right, so what's the difference between this diagram and the kinds of diagrams you've seen before? Previously, we always dealt with a particular good, like beef or even labor. We had a labor market where there was just one so-called good being bought and sold, and that was labor hours. Now we're talking about the entire economy. We're viewing the entire economy as if it were a market. Right? This demand curve that we have here, we are now going to give a name to, and we are going to call it aggregate demand. or AD. The word aggregate, of course, stands for total. The word aggregate stands for total. So this is like total demand. Demand for all final goods and services. Yes? And the supply curve is going to be called aggregate supply, or AS. So instead of just calling it demand and supply, we now add the word aggregate, because aggregate stands for total, since we're talking about the entire economy. Okay? Now, where do we have equilibrium in this macroeconomy? We have equilibrium, as always, where the two curves intersect. So this is going to be where we have equilibrium. So this is where we're going to have macroeconomic equilibrium. And this equilibrium is going to yield us an equilibrium price level, and also an equilibrium level of real GDP. So we are going to get a P star, or equilibrium price level, and a Y star, which is, pardon me?
The demand.
No, hang on. Equilibrium real GDP. What do you mean by demand equilibrium?
I heard you say supply.
Oh, okay. Oh. So we have P star and Y star. P star is the equilibrium price level, and Y star is the equilibrium real GDP. Right? So there's nothing particularly new in this, right? You are by now very familiar with the idea of equilibrium in markets, correct? So when we have equilibrium, the quantity supplied of real GDP by firms is equal to the quantity demanded of real GDP by whom? Who are the people who demand real GDP? Demand final goods and services. Only consumers? Remember, I've always spoken about 4 shoppers. There are 4 shoppers in the economy. Can somebody recall who these 4 are? Do you remember the formula for GDP by the expenditure approach? Now, isn't GDP by the expenditure approach equal to Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M? Do you recall this? Now tell me, who are the 4 shoppers?
The government and
That's the government. Households, well, that's households. Investors. What do you mean investors? What does investment consist of? Give me an example of investment. No. So you haven't, I've repeated this till I was blue in the face. Buying financial assets is not investment. No. In this course, investment consists of the purchase of machinery by businesses. Is that clear to everyone? If people buy stocks or land or stuff like that, well, that's not investment, not really. That's not what we mean by investment. So who buys machinery? Firms. So this would be shopping by firms for machinery. That's the I. And then finally, put that in brackets. Who does that? The rest of the world, precisely. So that is shopping by the rest of the world, of our goods. This is what the rest of the world buys from the US. Is that clear? So there are 4 shoppers in this economy. And so that lies behind, their shopping lies behind the aggregate demand curve. You see? So they are the ones responsible for that AD curve, these 4 shoppers. Right? So we have equilibrium in the macroeconomy when the quantity supplied of real GDP by firms is equal to the quantity demanded of real GDP by the four shoppers, namely households, the government, firms themselves who buy machinery, and the rest of the world. Now, this diagram is a very useful way to also look at a recession. How do we portray a recession in this diagram? And that's what I'm going to show you now. Now, we already know what potential GDP is, correct? What is potential GDP, somebody? When does the economy produce potential GDP or full employment real GDP? When all resources are employed. Is that correct? Of course, when we say all, we make one exception for labor, because there will always be that 4% naturally unemployed. Is that correct? But everyone else is working. 96% of the labor force is working. And all land, labor, and all land, capital, and entrepreneurship is fully employed. Right? That gives us potential GDP. Now, in this diagram here, I'm going to mark off my potential GDP. So potential GDP, also called full employment real GDP, Y sub F. I'm going to mark that in this diagram also. And I'm going to mark it here. So let's say that that is Y sub F. So what do we see happening here then? This economy seems to have come to equilibrium, giving us a level of real GDP Y star that is less than YF. So we have this gap between Y star and YF. The economy has settled at Y star. However, potential GDP happens to be bigger than Y star. So there is a gap then between Y star and YF. Now, what is the significance of this gap for unemployment? Let me ask you the following question. If GDP were YF, what would be the unemployment rate? What would be the unemployment rate at that level of GDP? If GDP were YF, if GDP equal potential GDP, what would be the unemployment rate? 4%, the natural rate, am I correct? Because we would have full employment, would we not? If GDP equals YF, we have full employment, and so the unemployment rate is going to be equal to the natural rate of 4%, approximately 4%. Now, you tell me, at this level of GDP, which is the current equilibrium value, what is the unemployment rate going to be in relation to that 4%? Is it going to be bigger than 4%, equal to 4%, or less than 4%? Would it be bigger? Now, that is correct, but why would it be bigger? The unemployment rate at GDP Y star, the current equilibrium value, I argue, is going to be greater than 4%. Why is that? Because that's a smaller level of GDP, isn't it? Now, we know from our production function diagram that you saw in class last time. And let me quickly draw that little production function here. Do you remember this little diagram from our last class? Here you have labor, and there you have real GDP. Correct? So I'm going to mark off YF there, and this is the Y star. Now tell me, which level of GDP, YF or Y star, requires less labor to make? Y star, exactly, because Y star only needs L1 labor to make, whereas YF needs L2 labor to make. Is that correct? So therefore, at GDP level Y star, the amount of employment would be less than at GDP YF. Correct? There'd be less employment, and if there's less employment, wouldn't there be more unemployment? Am I making sense? Less employment translates to more unemployment. Is that correct? So therefore, at GDP level Y star, what is the unemployment rate going to be? It's going to be greater than the natural rate. Unemployment rate should be greater than the natural rate. There will be, in other words, at GDP level Y star, there shall be, in addition to the frictionally unemployed, in addition to that 4%, you will now have another category of unemployed workers. And what is that category called, somebody? Remember, we said there were 3 kinds of unemployment, right? Frictional, structural, and cyclical, right? So now at GDP level Y star, we have an unemployment rate that's greater than 4%. In other words, it must be that in addition to the 4% naturally unemployed, you now have what kind of unemployment? Cyclical unemployment. So you have cyclically unemployed workers in addition to the naturally unemployed. In other words, this is an economy in recession. Correct? Remember, cyclical unemployment is unemployment that changes according to the business cycle. When the business cycle dips, when the economy enters a recession, that's when cyclical unemployment rises. Correct? So this gap here between Y star and YF, we can now give a name to. This is called a recessionary gap. A recessionary gap. So this then is an economy in recession, where the economy delivers to us an equilibrium level of GDP Y star that is less than full employment real GDP or potential GDP. So that's your recession. Correct?
And what's it called again? The gap?
It's written there, recessionary gap. Right? Recessionary gap is the name of that gap. So this is an economy in recession. Now, occasionally, it's possible to have what's called an inflationary gap. And let me draw a diagram for an inflationary gap. Real GDP, price level, aggregate demand, aggregate supply. This is our equilibrium real GDP, and this is our equilibrium price level. P star, Y star. But now, YF happens to be somewhat to the left of Y star. So unlike the previous diagram where YF was to the right of Y star, in this diagram, YF is a bit to the left of Y star. This gap here also has a name. It's called an inflationary gap. That's an inflationary gap. Now tell me, at this unemployment rate, YF, what is the, rather at this level of GDP YF, what is the unemployment rate? At GDP YF, what is the unemployment rate? 4%, the natural rate, correct? Always, when you have GDP equals to YF, the unemployment rate is the natural rate of unemployment, which is approximately 4%. At this level of GDP, what shall be the unemployment rate? Shall it be bigger than 4% or smaller than 4%? Shall it be bigger than 4% or smaller than 4%? I'd like you to quickly look at that production function that we have here. This production function, and tell me, what does that tell you? We now have a Y star which is, where? Here. This is our Y star. Now, with that level of y star, what's the level of employment going to be? Well, I should have stretched this curve, but you can see right away that at the green y star that I've drawn there, above yf, the level of employment shall be bigger than L2. Is that correct? Now, more employment translates to less unemployment. Is that right? So therefore, in this diagram, what's the unemployment rate here going to be? Bigger than 4%? Smaller than 4%? Less than the natural rate. So you shall have an unemployment rate that's a bit less than the natural rate, less than 4%. Now, this is a situation where firms are so desperate for workers that they are going to the pool of the naturally unemployed, frictionally and structurally unemployed, grabbing those workers and retraining them at their own expense. This is a labor market where there is a big shortage of workers. Right? So this is an inflationary gap. Now let me go back to the previous diagram, because recessions are clearly more worrisome than when you have inflationary gaps. Because when you have inflationary gaps, the economy is doing super great, you see. We've exceeded full employment. So there's nothing really to worry about, at least in terms of unemployment. There is a worry, though, and that worry is going to be inflation. But I'll talk about that later. Right? Here, though, we have a major worry, and that is that the unemployment rate at present, at the current level of equilibrium, is greater than 4%. So you have an unemployment rate of, let's say, 7%, 8%, 9%. You have a lot of cyclically unemployed workers. Now, this is something that worries the government and the Federal Reserve Bank. Right? So what steps do you think can be taken to bring the economy in this story back to full employment? Is the question. And that is something that is going to occupy us for the rest of this course. What can the government and the Fed, and let me write these two terms down. You have, on the one hand, you have the government and you have the Fed. The government and the Fed. The Fed stands for what? That's what it stands for, the Federal Reserve Bank. Have you heard of the Federal Reserve Bank? You may have heard of it, but you're going to certainly learn about it in some depth in this course. Federal Reserve Bank. So these are two entities that now take steps to bring the economy back to full employment. Now, why do I make this separation between the government and the Fed? Isn't the Fed a government body? Well, yes, it is a government body, but it is constitutionally independent of the president or Congress. It's independent. It's like the Supreme Court. And that's why I speak of it separately. I don't classify that with government. When I say government, I mean the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government, president and Congress. The Fed is separate. The Fed is independent. So what can these two bodies do to bring the economy back to full employment? I have 1 minute, in which I'm quickly going to give you a sense of this. Well, if this aggregate demand curve were shifted to the right, if this aggregate demand curve were shifted to the right, and let me show you where. Shifted to the right like this. I'm sorry, I've shifted the wrong curve. I've shifted the supply curve. I apologize. I need to shift the demand curve to the right, okay? So if I shift the demand curve to the right like this, wouldn't the economy come back to full employment? Not very well drawn here. I want the intersection to be there, correct? So if the demand curve in this story were made to shift to the right like that, we would have a new equilibrium. And what would that new equilibrium be? the new equilibrium would be here. Correct? That would be the new equilibrium, right? And what would be equilibrium GDP with that new equilibrium? What would equilibrium GDP be at that new equilibrium? Wouldn't it be YF? Yes. So now the economy's equilibrium GDP equals YF. So the economy has come back to full employment, right? So this is really what the government and Fed do. They take steps to stimulate demand in the economy. So the government and Fed take steps to make the four shoppers, what you know about, households, government, firms, rest of the world. The government takes steps to make these four guys shop more. By making them shop more, the aggregate demand curve here shifts to the right, and that reduces the recessionary gap down to zero, and the economy comes back to full employment. Let's stop here today.